Production funding for Richmond Memories is provided by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
What is it about our memory that makes the past seem sweeter? The winters had more snow and summer days were longer back in those days.
Central Virginia's Public TV presents Richmond Memories.
The neighborhoods where we grew up, the corner drugstore, the movie theater, are a memory now. They're stored away where images never fade, and yesterday is always waiting for us. Hello, I'm Charlie McDowell. I'll be your host through a nostalgic and very personal look at the Richmond of years gone by. It's a selective history of a city and the times, as told by the people who lived it. So hop aboard the streetcar and ride back in time as we share some Richmond memories. For many of us, there's something missing from Richmond's streets today, something that vanished without a trace. What happened to the streetcars? If you lived in Richmond before 1949, you can close your eyes and hear the sound of steel wheels on the tracks. The rhythm became the heartbeat of the city, and that sound has been etched into our collective memory. As far back as the mid-1800s, Richmond had a street rail system. The original cars were horse-drawn and the routes were limited, but it was a start. By 1888, Richmond had an electric-powered street railway system that helped shape the city we know today. Many of today's bus routes still follow the original streetcar lines.
There was still a need for expanding into other areas, and there were experimental electric streetcar systems in other cities, but each had a major design flaw that kept it from being really successful. And this is the point at which some financiers in New York and some in Richmond got their heads together and said, we've been hearing about this Frank Sprague and his electric motor, and he claims that he can build a streetcar system that will overcome all these shortcomings of the others in the other cities. Let's get him, let's sign him up.
Isn't it strange? You accept things. They're part of your life. They'll always be part of your life. And one day they're gone, like the streetcars. Oh, gee, we rode to school in the streetcars. I rode in the streetcars to see that girl across town, several girls across town. How we used to love to cut up on the streetcar.
I can remember being in traffic with my dad driving the car, and we would be following a streetcar, and particularly at night, with the sparks shooting off of the element or the pulley at the top of the streetcar. There was an element of danger, and so they seemed sort of mysterious to a small child. I was a very young child at the time, and there was that element of danger that made it exciting. So it was always fun to ride one, knowing that you were shooting sparks.
They had sections at each block. They had a little section right near the streetcar track that people would stand in. And can you imagine standing in the street with cars going by today? But you didn't even think about it then. You just stood there waiting for your streetcar.
You met a lot of friendly people, and I had one guy used to run for that trolley car every morning. And the people on the, my pastor used to call him Dagwood Bumstead because he had to run every morning to catch that trolley car. And I used to have to look for him. I looked for him. If he wasn't there, I knew he was sick.
It was a very personal sort of thing. You knew everybody and he knew everybody, and if you were sick, he knew that you had missed riding with him and he would want to know how you are. And he was like the family doctor.
I've seen many times pull up to a stop where I knew certain people were supposed to be there, and I'd pull up there and stop, and in maybe a minute or so you'd see them come and catch a car. And that's what they really appreciated.
Growing up on Clay Street was a marvelous experience. We lived then at number 6 East Clay, which is right across the street where we're standing. And in that particular house, which has 3 floors, we would live for the times that the trolleys used to run along the street. And the trolley would stop right at this corner right here, you know. But that wasn't the thing that we would always wait for. The thing that we would wait for in the winter time was when it snowed, because we knew that the trolleys could not run on the tracks until the sweeper came along. So we would hear the sweeper coming and we would rush to the 3rd floor and look out the bay windows and watch the sweeper with the big brushes sweeping the tracks until it disappeared. And we would not leave this 3rd floor until the trolley came back and swept the other tracks all the way down. And this was one of the greatest memories for children. We lived for the sweepers to come along.
January the 20th, 1940, we had the heaviest snowfall on record. And streetcars, even streetcars, were stranded all over the city where they couldn't get any further. They the snow would insulate the streetcar from the track, so you couldn't get any traction to do anything. And they was just spotted all over the city, just where they couldn't go any further. A lot of people spent the night in streetcars.
Well, I used to love to take the Anfield streetcar there. And, when you leave the inner line there, they had a drop down in the bottom like that. And you'd put it on 5 point, 9 point, and you just, it'd roll it down the track there, and that streetcar would be just wobbling back and forth like that. And sometimes you didn't have anybody, so you enjoyed and things like that. And just see how fast the streetcar would run, and they would really roll.
School children were on the streetcar. They used to pull all kinds of pranks. They would pull the trolley wire down, so your streetcar would stop, the motor would start. And by the time you got halfway to the back to put it back on, they had put it back on themselves. Then I had trouble with children not paying. Some of the children would have passes. So they would get on first, and then they would hand the pass out the window to somebody else.
As kids, we would get on the streetcar and race to the back, and this was all by design, and get a transfer and hand our transfers out the back. And so that the kid we handed to would race forward before the last person was aboard and the doors were closed, and he would leap on. And of course, the motorman was pretty savvy, but for some reason he would let us go most of the time. But every now and then he would realize that somebody had been switching transfers and kick us off, which was, so we just waited till the next car. And
there's one thing, if they bring the streetcars back, there's one thing I wish they would do away with. And that bell that you push with your foot, the ding dong, don't include that.
You want a whistle?
I want something, a horn or something other than that.
With wartime gasoline rationing in effect, ridership was at an all-time high. Due to a shortage of materials, no new streetcars could be ordered during World War II. The car barns were kept busy repairing older cars to keep them in service. As the number of automobiles on the city streets increased, the streetcars just seemed to be too slow and cumbersome in traffic. And so in November 1946, buses were tested on the Main Street West Hampton line for a 90-day period. No streetcar ever ran there again. It was the beginning of the end for Richmond's street railway system. The following year, the transit company announced a plan for substituting buses for all the streetcar lines. One by one, the remaining lines shut down. Then, on November 25, 1949, Richmond's streetcars made their last revenue run for the Hull Street Highland Park line. Bands played, speeches were made, crowds gathered to watch the procession as the streetcars rolled off to a storage yard to be burned.
They were burned because scrap iron, clean scrap iron, got a much better price than scrap iron that was contaminated with leather seats, wooden floors, some brass, but mainly combustibles. So it was advantageous to put gasoline or some flammable inside on the seats and on the wooden floors and the mahogany paneling and set them afire and burn out all the combustibles. Then the scrap iron was considered clean and got a better price. In fact, I tried very hard to buy one. The bodies were about $200 and the complete streetcar was somewhere in the $400 to $500 range, complete, ready to run. Now we wish we had a few.
After 61 years of faithful service to the city, Richmond's streetcars became a memory.
I don't know that everyone knows that the trolley system in Richmond was the first successful trolley system in the United States. And to make it more attractive, these parks were developed as destinations for the trolley system. And the one that ran between Highland Park and Forest Hill was very successful. And in the early days, before I was born, I understand that they used the summer cars, and they were the open cars. And they came across the 9th Street Bridge, which was a rickety wooden bridge, and people thought they were taking their lives in their hands to come across the bridge. But it was worth it to get to the amusement park. Now, I lived about 3 blocks from the Forest Hill amusement park. And we could hear every evening on a hot summer night, you know, there was no air conditioning, so all our windows were open. And you could just hear the screams.
I never liked the dips. Believe it or not, I could do things in an airplane, but I couldn't stand the dips. Oh, it was fascinating. When Forest Hill Park was an amusement center, I was quite small. But I can remember Mother and Daddy taking me out there and walking around, riding the hobby horses, and I particularly loved to go fish. They had a thing with water running, and you'd put a little line in and you'd hook a fish, and whatever the number was, you got that prize. And oh, the hot dogs smelled so good and tasted so good. Always had to have a little of that onion smell in it. And it was just a fabulous place. And then after the amusement park went away and we were older, it was cleared. All of us would go out there as a marvelous place to go sleigh riding. And whenever it would snow, that's where we would go and had lots of fun, and it was always crowded.
Nobody's business but our own. And the folks all say that Sue's a flirtin', but if she is one thing certain. It's nobody's business but our own. Oh, it's nobody's
Saturday nights in Richmond were reserved for WRVA's Old Dominion Barn Dance. From 1946 through 1957, its weekly performances packed the old Lyric Theater at 9th and Broad Street to capacity. Broadcast over WRVA's 50,000-watt station, the barn dance could be heard in 38 states and parts of Canada. It was also a regular segment of Saturday Night Country Style, a program broadcast coast to coast. It introduced the nation to country music. John Tansey was WRVA's general manager during those years.
But once it got going, there was no stopping it. People were lined up originally at the mosque, which I think at that time seated about 4,000 people. And when it moved to the WRVA Theater, there were two shows, one at 7:30, and my recollection is that it was at second show at 9:30, and they'd be lined up down 9th Street and around Broad Street waiting to get into the show. Families, it was real down-to-earth family entertainment.
The barn dance was so much a part of Richmond in later years. It became a focal point for people from all of Virginia and really from all over the country, because at one time it was broadcast nationally, coast to coast. Some of the great stars of yesterday and today played at the Old Dominion Barn Dance. Appropriately, it was at the old Lyric Theater, later named the WRVA Theater at 9th and Broad.
It was often thought that these people were just country people that came to see the Old Dominion Barn Dance. But we used to marvel at the number of fur coats that we would see in the audience from the city.
Saturday nights at 9th and Broad, backstage at the old Lyric Theater, was pure playtime for me, because as the celebrities would come through town, I would get to be friends with them. I have wonderful pictures with Gene Autry and Annie Oakley. There was a gentleman who's still in the business now, Ronnie Reno, that was my boyfriend for a whole weekend because he was there and gave me a locket, and was close to my age.
The star of the barn dance and a driving force behind its success was Mary Workman, better known to audiences as Sunshine Sue.
The person that you saw and dealt with was the real person. She was a very sweet, albeit very efficient business person, but she stood by her word, and she was just a lovely lady, and you couldn't help but love her.
There was a quality about Sue that remained in the minds of people who had worked with her and people that she started. And she started many of the great country and western stars. So she was a multi-dimensional person, Sunshine Sue. I see her in her little gingham and calico dresses when she'd go out and talk to everybody. Called her husband Sugarfoot.
She saw through a phony in a minute. She didn't allow that type of person to surround her. And so from a business sense, I believe she could have been just extremely successful had she been willing to move to Nashville at the point in time in the late 50s when this area was not supporting the country western music.
One of the biggest fans of the barn dance was Governor Bill Tuck, who officially crowned Sunshine Sue Queen of the Hillbillies. Stories abound about Virginia's colorful governor and his love of country music. John Tansey remembers a story.
Governor Tuck was probably one of the outstanding patrons of the barn dance, and we had a seat reserved for him for any time he decided to come over, and he did frequently on Saturday nights. One story I recall was that he would invite members of the cast over to the governor's mansion, and he'd get his friend, and I think it was Jimmy Edwards, who was then the hillbilly governor of Louisiana, and he'd get the members of the cast of the Old Dominion Barn Dance to play for Jimmy on the telephone in Louisiana. And then the governor of Louisiana would play his guitar, or starvation box as they used to call it in those days, back on the telephone to the Virginia governor's mansion. And that went on several times that I'm aware of.
Richmond and the rest of the country were not ready to accept country music into the mainstream. In 1957, Mary Workman and her husband, who had created and directed the original barn dance, decided to retire. And Saturday nights in Richmond have never been the same.
Sunshine, let's hear it. Let's hear it. You make me happy when skies are gray. You never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away.
Good night. God bless you all for coming.
There were essentially two commercial centers in downtown Richmond. North of Broad Street in Jackson Ward, 2nd Street was a thriving commercial and cultural center that the African American community called its own.
There are people from all walks of life. You could find, well, the guys whose reputation wasn't so good, and you can find the lawyers and doctors and even the, well, you didn't see preachers on there, but the, everybody knew 2nd Street.
So 2nd Street had everything. We didn't have to go too far for what we wanted, you know, because they had the hotels, they had the restaurants, they had the jewelry shop, they had the dentist's office, they had the doctor's offices, and they had the furniture stores, and you name it. It was in this area. In fact, Jackson Ward was so famous in 1900 that at the exposition in Paris, it was used as a model for black entrepreneurs.
But 2nd Street was most of the businesses, most professionals were in that area. And of course, from Thursday night through Sunday night, the nights, the street was just covered with people.
Yeah, the place was jumping.
Jumping, yeah. And of course, this is back during, it wasn't, when I came back here, Prohibition was over, but we didn't have, you didn't have restaurants, I mean, they didn't have liquor license. You could have, we had what they call private clubs. And you're supposed to belong to the club, and you could put your bottle in the, you're supposed to have your bottle at the club, see? Yeah, it was for everybody. And they had 3 or 4 or 5 juice joints all up down 2nd Street. And Slaughter's Hotel and dining room. That was a famous eating place for Negroes because, you see, to get around the segregation on trains and buses and things, most Negroes traveled by automobile. And everybody wanted to stop at Slaughter's. And Slaughter was famous for his Smithfield ham and steaks. And you could go in Slaughter's and you'd always see somebody going up down the East Coast.
2nd Street was known as a hub of entertainment. Dance halls, and there were several, played an important role in the social life of the community.
We're standing here near the W.I. Johnson Funeral Home at 10 West Lee Street. As far back as I can remember, this hall has been here, this building has been here. Upstairs on the 2nd floor, that was the Johnson's Ballroom, managed by Mr. Johnson, the owner, managed by his wife. You can see that it was a narrow building, but long. The ballroom started just about where that 2nd window is and ran all the way back, and that's the bandstand back on the end. And so you had the whole length
Johnson's Hall was an elongated hall. It went from the front of the street all the way back to the alley. In the early years, Virginia Union used to play basketball games in Johnson's Hall. See, they had no gymnasium in Richmond.
Mrs. Price, she was the manager and the overseer, you might say, of the Price's Hall when the dancers were there. And she was very strict about how you conducted yourself on the dance floor. You didn't hold the girls too close and whatnot. And she would say, "Brother, watch it, brother." Things like that. And everybody respected her command. They respected that. A very lovable person she was. We were standing across the street from the Apollo Theater, which years ago was known as the Hippodrome Theater, one of the most historic theaters in the city of Richmond. Back in those days, beginning with, as far as I can remember, back to 1915. This was a day, those were the days of the silent movies. And they would have vaudeville shows after the movies.
But there was another side to 2nd Street in Jackson Ward, a place of churches and families and fond memories.
I would sum up the years between the 20s and the 30s, where I'm concerned, as the years of revelation. I began to realize what it meant to be a member of a family, to be a member of a block, to be a member of a community, all of which was church related. On Sundays, we would get up and go to Sunday school. We would leave Sunday school, we'd go to church. We would come home and be sure and change our clothes, and maybe later go to a night service. But almost always, we would attend the BYPU, which was called the Baptist Young People's Union. Growing up in that particular time and area was a time of what we call close family communal relationships. You didn't just live in a house, you lived in a block, and everybody in that block had an interest in everybody else.
That's the key there. They looked out for everybody, and everybody protected their children and someone else's children, because everybody, it all was just like one big family. That's the way it was then, but you can't do that now.
One of the great interesting characters that sticks in my mind is Miss Ada, who was Marion Moore's mother. She had a reputation for having always had soup on that stove, and the pot never ever got dry. Neighbors would always bring something in, and particularly people who were sick would come over and take a bowl of soup to somebody who was ill, and they would always feel better, and it was sort of like a cure. And over the years, we always was wondering what was the magic ingredient in that soup, and what we really come to the conclusion that it was the penicillin of human love, and it just had a magic way of working on people. Also, there was a lot of care that was expressed in that soup, and one of the merchants, who was the father of the present owners of the Watkins Funeral Home, was a huckster, and frequently when he would come in and had extra vegetables, he would always be sure and take something around there and make sure that the soup always stayed on the stove. And these old wooden stoves, even in the summertime, they would stay warm, and they would have that soup on the stove.
Didn't get lost on 2nd Street until, you might say, the 60s, during the civil rights movement and the end of segregation. It was a wonderful thing that happened. In one way, in another way, it was disastrous. It wiped out a whole community of people who just got along so beautiful. A lot of the businesses folded. That was just a little sad note, but still, there's a lot of beauty about everything about 2nd Street that make you forget about it when you reminisce and think about all the good things that happened there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Before television, before suburban shopping malls, there was downtown, the heart of Richmond. Everyone went downtown. People from as far away as North Carolina came to Richmond to shop the big department stores and stay at the grand hotels. Downtown drew people from the surrounding rural counties for a day in the city. Even for the people who lived in Richmond, going downtown was an event. For many, it was a ritual.
Shopping in Richmond was to go downtown. And downtown, as far as most people in Richmond, considered Miller and Rhodes and Thalheimer's the meccas of all of downtown. And when you went there, you intended to spend probably all day long. You would shop between the two stores. And of course, you know, there was a sort of an unwritten law that 6th Street belonged to the department stores and to the people who lived in Richmond. If there was any traffic on it, it stopped so that the pedestrians could go from one store to the other. And you went back and forth and back and forth. And then at lunchtime, you always made a point of being in Miller and Rhodes' tea room to see the fashion shows.
One never went downtown without at least your white gloves. As a child, I could get away with going hatless, but I had to wear the white gloves. And did you know that it's easier to wash your white gloves while wearing them? Just a little tip I thought I'd pass along.
Going to the mall is fine. You can buy what you want to buy. You can see various things, but there's nothing special about it. Going downtown was special because you had to make a trip, and you had to get dressed, and you had to look just so, and everyone else looked just so. And this made it an occasion, and that made it something to look forward to. It wasn't just, oh, I gotta go buy something, I've gotta shop because we need something. It was, I get to go shopping. That's exciting. You know, it's not exciting anymore. It's a chore.
I also remember in Thalheimer's, as you went in the 5th Street entrance, they had a fountain there that perfume came out of constantly. And it smells so good when you walk through there. And one day Estelle and I took her little 3-year-old daughter with us, and we didn't pay any attention to her. Nancy had been clutching her hand all the way into Richmond. And as we walked by, Nancy stuck her little hand up underneath that bottle of perfume, of the perfume coming out of the fountain, and filled a little bottle. And Estelle was so embarrassed, I thought she was going to jerk her arm off. But she remembered, she knew she was going to walk by that fountain, and she wanted to get some of that perfume. And she did.
Miller and Rhodes Tea Room was really a part of our culture. Miller and Rhodes Tea Room right across from Lowe's. People would meet each other in front of the clock at Thalheimer's and then at Lowe's, or they'd go to the movies and then come over to Miller and Rhodes Tea Room. But the ladies would dress up and bring their daughters, and they'd dress up in their hats, those Sarah Sue hats, and their white gloves, and they'd go up to Miller and Rhodes Tea Room to see all of their friends. Finally, the men became so upset, they set aside a little corner called the men's corner for the men, and men would go there. Food was good, delightful place. All the celebrities would come and be on the runway along with the models every day. And then, of course, Eddie Weaver began to play at Miller Road's Tea Room for so many years. It was a gathering place.
It was fun to model. It was like being paid to have a good time, which was nice. And then we had people, there were people who ate in the tea room all the time, and you saw the same ladies every single day, and they sort of became your friends, and you knew about their families. It was a fun, exciting time.
But there was responsibility being a Miller and Rhodes model. Wherever you went in the community, you represented the store. The people would be instantly attracted and excited. Oh, are you a Miller and Rhodes model? And what's new this season? So you were always aware that you really represented this whole store, the whole community of the store, the fashion, and you carried yourself accordingly. It was a time where it was white gloves and party manners and great civility to one another, good manners, graciousness. It was a quieter time, it was a slower time, but it was great being one of the models at Miller and Rhodes.
Oh, I miss Miller and Rhodes so much. It was a time past. Of course, I grew up in Richmond, so I had gone to the Miller and Rhodes Tea Room from the time I was a tiny tot, since I could first remember. So the tea room and the models was a part of my childhood.
For almost 50 years, Eddie Weaver was as much a fixture in Miller and Rhodes Tea Room as its club sandwiches.
That's what I'm telling this guy. Took me over to the tea room and said, we just bought an organ and we have nobody to play it. Would you mind playing it? Can you play Stardust? And that's the way I talked. I said, yes, I can play Stardust. He says, will you come over and play it for me? I said, sure. So I did. I had about a half hour before I went on at Lowe's. And I went over there and I played Stardust. They put the boss in there. He says, you want a job? I said, no, I got a job. I'm playing 4 shows a day over here at Lowe's Theater. He says, oh, take one of them for your rest period and come over here and play. He wouldn't take no for an answer.
Show business was a big part of my life from when I was about 3 or 4 years old. I think I started out singing on his radio program. I believe the first thing I ever sang was One Day My Prince Will Come from Snow White, so that tells you when it was. And after that, I just spent a lot of time in the theater watching, listening, and thoroughly enjoying all the people who came through in the shows, and the movies, of course, which were all wonderful at that time. And later on, we played together in Miller and Rhodes and various other places.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we did. And I had to beg her on my knees to do it every time. Do, 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 do.
Television is still with us. However, there's a place in our memories for a simpler time, when every city had its own local host for the afternoon children's show. The production budgets for these shows were notoriously small. The sets were cardboard, and special effects were non-existent. In the 1950s and 60s, Richmond had its own kids' show host, Sailor Bob.
Well, ahoy, boys and girls, and welcome now to our TV schooner. Nice to have you with us again, and we're all set for another fine time here on the schooner. And I hope that you'll stay right there in front of your TV and be with us. Come on inside right now and join me here. The whole gang is with us, of course, today, as always. Bryant playing the music. Thanks for the banjo music at the opening of the show. And then Gulliver Gull, Mr. Mouse, and the Bluebird, our puppet friends, will all be with us today. And we have some special things planned, so we'll have a good time. Here comes Gulliver Gull right now.
Are you?
I think that television in the 50s was certainly different from television now because we were all live. Nothing was on tape. Nothing was recorded. There were live announcers for every break and live announcers for every commercial and live performers for every show. Of course, we did have film packages. My Little Marchie was a favorite. But mostly it's different because it was live and there was a certain tension and excitement about it. To go away from the studio and to go to see the children or see the result of what you had done on the air was amazing to me. You can sit in the studio, it's dark and you have your lights and you're doing your show, but is anybody out there? But when you go to the shopping center and they're all there, then it becomes real for you. And we had lots and lots of great times in shopping centers, schools, hospitals, just everywhere, meeting the children that watch the show daily. So that was a great excitement and good time for me. On Church Hill, Noldy's Bakery was located right at 25th and Broad Streets, or 26th and Broad Streets. And one vivid memory is to walk past the bakery, and they had these low windows where you could look through the iron or steel grates and see the men down working, taking these big trays of bread and dumping them onto a conveyor belt. And this wonderful aroma coming out. And later, as an adult, I had the opportunity to work for Noldy's Bakery as Sailor Bob to advertise for them. And we would give away the little loaves of Noldy's bread.
Noldy's American-made bread, the freshest thing in town. They were known for that. And everybody would say it. You'd say, Noldy's bread. No, Noldy's American-made bread. Many youngsters, I'm sure, still remember the little loaves, little tiny loaves that they would give you if you went over there or sampling. They were wonderful marketeers in their early days.
Back in 1957, an up-and-coming young singer performed at the mosque, and Richmond got its first look at the man who would become the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley.
Oh, we were right down front. I think we were in the front row. I mean, we were right there. In fact, I can remember trying to grab at him because he got down on the stage for one of the songs, and so of course we were all just trying to get as close as we could. I actually don't remember much of the concert because the noise was just deafening. The noise of the audience was so loud. They were mostly teenage girls, as you might imagine. And I'd say a good number of them were standing on their seats for most of the concert. we were right down front, so we didn't have to stand on their seats. I don't recall any fainting, but I do remember girls at the mosque the night Elvis came just jumping up and down and standing on the seats and dancing and really just beating up on each other, just with excitement, hitting each other's arms. It's like, oh, listen, look at that. There was, I don't remember being at any other concert where there was that level of excitement.
Every city once had a bustling farmer's market. Horse-drawn wagons loaded with produce were a familiar sight on city streets until the 1940s. Richmond had two major markets, downtown at 6th Street and 17th Street at Main.
As I lived within 2 blocks of Brook Avenue was the sort of the turnpike right on out into Hanover, and you would see, particularly on weekends, these green wagons with the red wheels coming in, bringing watermelon, cantaloupe, sweet Irish potatoes, and salted pork. You know, you'd hear them coming down saying, watermelon, cantaloupe, sweet Irish potatoes, and salted pork. And they would come in, and quite a few of them would end up down at the 6th Street Market. Now, on the way to the market, a lot of those people would sell some of their merchandise. One of the outstanding characters down the market was a guy called Can't Count Smith. And he had good merchandise, and people would come to him because he had a reputation for not being able to count. And not infrequently, he would give you too much change. And so people were sort of waylaying for him, hoping that he'd make a mistake, and every now and then he would. But to save a penny, they didn't realize that he had marked his stuff up by 2 cents, you know. So he was really crazy like a fox.
There was a neighbor that would come from the lower end of Charles City County going into Richmond, and he had to leave early in the morning, and when he'd come by my home, he'd have his lantern hanging on it to give a light for people to know that he was coming. And it was approximately 35 miles from his home to Richmond, and it took him the better portion of the day to get to Richmond. Then he'd put up his horse and his cart and then do his trading the next day, and then stay overnight and then come back the next day. And so that was a 3-day affair for him, from his home to Richmond and do his business and come back.
We would invariably go down on a Saturday with our little red wagons, and my father would probably stop at a place where maybe they had a bushel of pears, and he would dicker with the man. And sometimes when he would go down there late, and we would wonder why he would always be late, but he would be late because the merchant would want to hurry up and close down, and he would give it to him at a little bit cheaper price, and then we would bring those things home, and my mother would proceed to cut up all those pears, and she would preserve them. And then when school started, we would always take a couple of pieces of bread with some preserves. That would be our lunch. And this doesn't seem like much by today's standards, but back then it was sufficient, and it satisfied the need.
Daddy would take huckleberries and blackberries in season to the pie factory in Richmond. This is in the late 30s, early 40s, and it was Ms. Chamberlain's Pies. It was over there on 7th and Hull Streets in Richmond. And usually when we'd go there and take the produce or the pie fruits, they'd give Daddy 1 or 2 pies, and we'd eat pie on our way home. I think you could get the pies that were slightly damaged for a dime or 10 cents. And people would come in off the street and buy just 1 slice of pie too. And they would cut through the plate and give you this slice of pie on that section of plate, just like the pie crust was. As one of my neighbors said, the first time he got one like that, he bit the plate and all. He told him his pie was good, but his crust was certainly tough.
The site of Richmond's airport was a cow pasture chosen by pilot Roscoe Turner early in 1927. By September of that year, the airport had been designated as a stop on the New York to Atlanta airmail run, and a colorful period in aviation history began.
The Pitcairn Mail Wing was flown just about over the country, but mostly on the East Coast, from the middle 20s to possibly the early 30s. And it was used for the early mail runs, yes. The airmail routes were all over the country, but the ones in the East Coast, which is where the Pitcairn was mostly based, ran from Maine to Florida, right through Richmond, and Richmond was its dispatching point for all runs north, all runs south. And the Pitcairn was the main airplane used. The men who flew the Pitcairns on the mail runs were mostly happy-go-lucky guys, hard-drinking, heavy-living guys
who enjoyed their flying would do nothing else except that. They flew anytime, anywhere. There were no such things as holidays. There were no such things as night and day. Very rarely did heavy weather deter them, which is the reason that 39 of the first 41 got killed the first year, because most of them went down in bad weather. Only 2 existed after that, one of them being Dick Merrill, who became the leading pilot for Eastern Airlines in later years. But the group were very dedicated to trying to promote the use and the practicality of aviation. And through airmail flying was the only way then that they could do it. And they would push through in any type of weather. The mail was flown at night because the airmail, the post offices were finished processing the letters that had to go out of the city by the closing of the day. Then the mail was then taken out to an airport. By the time they were put on an airplane, it was deep into the night. And then it was flown to the destination cities during the night so that they would be there when the post offices in those cities were opened in the morning to deliver the mail.
Who could compare the modern multiplex cinemas with the movie palaces of the past? In the late 1920s, Richmond's Theater Row along Broad Street boasted 18 theaters. The advent of the talkies and lush screen spectacles helped Richmonders forget about the Great Depression. While the movies were in black and white, the theaters were fantasies of color and imagination. It was an era of architectural opulence. There was the magnificent National, perhaps the most beautiful of all the theaters. The Bijou, which later became the Strand, and the Isis Theater right next door. There was the classic Odeon at 6th Street. And the Grand at 7th and Broad. Just down the street was the Colonial. It was said to be the largest motion picture theater in the South. It could seat 1,800 people. All of these great theaters lit up Broad Street, and most of them are gone now. The 1926 Lowe's Theater still stands, restored to its original appearance as the Carpenter Center for the Performing Arts. Many Richmonders can recall exactly where they sat when they saw Gone with the Wind for the first time at Lowe's, and how long they stood in line.
I went to John Marshall High School, as did a lot of the kids. Thomas Jefferson came along later, but we'd walk out of there and go down by Price Brothers, where we got all of our supplies, and then by the Sonny Boy Inn, turn right. There were all these movie theaters, the Colonial and the State, the Vaudeville National Theater, and up in the next block was another one.
And of course, in those days, you really got your dime's worth. You had a newsreel and a Three Stooges comedy and a serial episode of Flash Gordon and Dick Tracy, and then a cartoon and half a dozen previews of coming attractions. And of course, the Western came on with Buck Jones or Tom Mix or Bob Steele or whoever. And I just started going, you know, on a regular basis after that. I went to the Venus on a regular basis just about every Saturday. But prior to the Western and the serial coming to the Venus, it originally came to the Grand Theater at 7th and Broad Street. So if it was a star, like Johnny Mack Brown was one of my favorites, if he was in the Western, I would go to the Grand. I'd get the streetcar, and I would see it at the Grand on Friday or Saturday. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, it would come to the Venus. If I liked it well enough, I would go to the Venus to see it. If I liked it a great deal, 2 or 3 weeks later, it went to the Patrick Henry at 25th and Marshall Street. I would get the streetcar over to Churchill and see it once again. So, yes, I did go to other theaters other than the Venus. And a block down the street from the Venus, of course, was the Ponton, which showed Westerns on Monday and Tuesday, where the Venus showed their Westerns on Saturdays.
Music and live stage entertainment were an added bonus to the motion picture show. For many years, Eddie Weaver played the organ at Lowe's.
Oh, well, there's 3 buttons on the organ. One says up, one says down, and the other says stop. So I pressed the up button, and it started. And I started playing and looking at the song slides up there and talking to the audience just like I did and saying, let's sing this thing. And I didn't notice that it was any different. Kept on playing the 2 or 3, 4 songs, and all of a sudden I heard people sort of kind of, you know, oh my God, look, yeah, I could hear it. Something was wrong. And I turned around to bow and looked, and I was looking at the balcony. I was up here. I was supposed to be down here. Supposed to be shot like that, you know. But that's when I said, it didn't work, and then I went like this, getting over to the side so I could jump down off the organ onto the stage. So I was up over high up over the stage, about that far.
But perhaps no theater holds as many memories as the old Lyric Theater. Built in 1913 as a vaudeville theater, the Lyric at 9th and Broad became part of the Keith circuit. All the big names played there. The Lyric Theater's role changed suddenly in 1927, when at 4 a.m. on a cold February 19th, the Academy of Music was destroyed by fire. A bastion of culture for almost 40 years, the elegant Academy of Music, which stood on 8th Street between Grace and Franklin, had been the city's only legitimate theater. Following the fire, performances that would have played the Academy were moved to the Lyric. In its new legitimate role, the Lyric stage played host to all the current Broadway musicals and serious drama from the New York Theater Guild. But the Depression took its toll on theater attendance, and in 1939 the Lyric began showing movies.
I don't know that I remember anything special about the Lyric Theater. It was not a very large theater. You could hear all in it. You could see, though the second balcony rose straight up, and you almost like climbing a ladder. And I've said before that I believe that sometimes when I couldn't see what was going on the stage, I could tell how they parted the hair, because we were looking right down on top of their heads.
And I was fortunate. I didn't have any money, but I got a job as an usher. Now, you didn't get paid, but if you had a flashlight and a blue serge suit, you could become an usher if they selected you. And it was so wonderful to be able to see these people that I'd always dreamed of, because I wanted to be into showbiz. And then going down to the Lyric Theater, where early on it had been one of the Keith or one of the other chains of vaudeville theaters where the big stars came and performed.
The theater took on a new life in 1946 as the home of WRVA's Old Dominion Barn Dance. After the barn dance closed, the Lyric struggled to keep its doors open with traveling shows, dance recitals, and children's theater. Finally, in 1963, 50 years after it had opened, the venerable Lyric fell to the wrecking ball and disappeared from the Richmond landscape, gone but never to be forgotten. World War II had a profound effect on life in Richmond. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, brought the reality of war home to the city. It was no longer the Allies' war, it was our war too. Less than a month after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the city of Richmond leased Byrd Airport to the Army at the rate of $1 a year. Richmond Army Air Base became the training base for fighter pilots flying the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Private citizens and industry geared up for the long days ahead. Local industries turned their production lines to supplying the war effort. There were blackout drills. Daylight time or wartime went into effect. Richmonders planted victory gardens. Scrap drives cleaned up the city's backyards and vacant lots. A landmark, the bridge which connected the two buildings of Murphy's Hotel, was demolished and sold for scrap metal. People found they had more money to spend, but less to spend it on.
We always had meatless Tuesdays. And we always had, we had ration books. I've got some over there on my desk. The ration stamps you had to have to buy certain things. I think sugar was a big thing that we had to do without.
Gas was a big thing too at that time.
Oh, yes.
And gas was rationed, and you would give them ration tickets, and not enough to last you really. So again, you had to be sort of careful how much driving you did and how far you drove, or you'd run out of gas and wouldn't have any more to last you until you got another allotment of tickets.
And milk products, especially for your child, was very important. So mothers of small children and whatever, if one had milk and the other one didn't, they shared. And you managed your ration stamps. And as I said, it was just a close-knit community. Nobody fought each other. Everybody pulled together. And we won. We all just pulled together and we won.
Men and women in uniform were a common sight on Richmond's streets. Camp Lee, Camp Pickett, the Bellwood Army Services Depot, and A.P. Hill Military Reservation surrounded the city. USOs had to keep expanding to meet the growing number of servicemen. For the first time, women took on jobs traditionally held by men. In 1942, the DuPont plant began hiring women on the night shift. Women drove taxis. The Women's Auxiliary State Police WASP unit was formed. There was even a woman barber in town. Virginia Vaughn fulfilled a lifelong dream and became a streetcar operator.
To be a motorman operator of the streetcar was very special to me. It was something that I had wanted to do for a long time. I had always been interested in things like that. And to be of service to my country that way. I was filling in for some man that went into the service.
Genevieve Orange, a licensed pilot and instructor, served in the Civil Air Patrol.
The ladies that flew in those days were most enthusiastic, and we were anxious to do something, and we decided to organize a ladies auxiliary of the Civil Air Patrol. And we met at the Sowers building, and I can never smell cinnamon now without thinking of the Civil Air Patrol and the Sowers building. There were not that many rivalries in the Civil Air Patrol between the men and the women because the men did completely different things. They had offshore duty, looking for submarines, things of that nature. The women, we flew just simple missions, say down to Langley Field, or would fly an officer somewhere that he wanted to go. So there really was not that much rivalry, but there was a lot of enthusiasm.
Oh, the places we went when we were younger, and the times we had. We all had our favorite places. Many of them are gone now, but the memories of those good times live on.
One very outstanding thing different from now is if you wanted to go to the movies in the evening, and we always liked to go out for ice cream or something after the movie before we went home. In those days, there were practically no places you could go. There was a place called the Clover Room, and it was out on Malvern and Broad. And that was very popular. The people of Richmond went to the Clover Room. That was open till midnight or maybe even later. So you could go after the movies, and you would see your friends because it was so popular. And it was like a gathering place. Richmond, in a way, was a very small town. And there was hardly any place you could go you didn't see someone you knew, which was fun. It really was nice.
There was a Clover Room, yes. Yes, I went there many times. And then there was Chicken in the Rough and Orange Julius. We used to go to all those places. And I believe Orange Julius is Byram's now. And it was so, we used to go back there and dance. They had a place in the back that you could dance. So all the crowd would go there and dance. It was lots of fun.
Well, it was really great going to Ruger's Hotel. It was something very special when we went to Ruger's. And I remember one time we went and we took our little boy who was about 4 years old at the time. And he couldn't read the menu, but for some reason he must have seen a lobster, and that's all he wanted for dinner. And at that time, we couldn't afford lobster. So, of course, he was rather unhappy for a few minutes, but just being at Ruger's satisfied him.
I don't guess I really knew or realized how fortunate I was to have been part of that particular scene in Richmond. I can remember the Hotel Richmond Winter Garden and Henry Bryant and his orchestra. He dressed in tails when he directed the orchestra and had a baton. And the Madonna sisters that sang with him, and I did so many shows up there, not particularly with that band, but at the Winter Garden. And then downstairs was the Chatterbox that you had little private dances. We used to go to dances there in the Chatterbox of the Hotel Richmond in the evening. Now, the Murphy Hotel, later the King Carter, we had private parties there and things of that kind. That was the Salesman's Hotel. And of course, across the street was the Capitol Hotel. That's where all of the vaudevillians and all of the people playing at the National Theater and at the Lyric Theater, they stayed there. The John Marshall, so elegant. Who can ever forget the Marshall Room? Great, great sort of a supper club. It was just very special. And we used to broadcast from all these places at night.
The John Marshall Hotel was in its heyday as I was growing up. And it was the hotel in the city, except for the Dowager Jefferson Hotel. And the John Marshall had a roof garden where many, many dances were held. And that was a little classier than Tantilla, tell you the truth. I mean, the hotel was a plus. So as you got a little older, the John Marshall was the place to go. And then they had a tea room, or a coffee shop, I guess they called it, down on the Grace Street side, Franklin Street side. Real nice place. They had, and they served John Marshall chocolate pie. Ooh, that was delicious. Everybody talked about it, but nobody could get the recipe. The John Marshall was the place.
Tantilla started it all. But equally important in our social life was the Westwood Supper Club, originally a golf course. Vincent Speranza, Jimmy Speranza had it, he and his wife Alice. And it was a different kind of thing. Originally a supper club. You eat spaghetti there, and they had an accordionist walk around. But it was much more intimate, much smaller. But the big bands played there, and lots of regional bands. We produced a Saturday afternoon show there. Westwood Supper Club was a favorite haunt of Dean Hudson. Many people remember, no kin to me, although we used to call each other cousins. Dean Hudson, the Florida clubman, would play there a lot of the time. And many of the local bands, as well as Tommy Dorsey and the big bands, played there too. Buddy Morrow and his trombone and orchestra. But Westwood started in an old, what had been the Golf Pro Shop, and part of that is still theirs. It's the Westwood Racket Club. But outside, they licked the air conditioning problem by having dancing under the stars. Entirely different. People loved that. So you'd go out and dance under the stars at the Westwood Supper Club. Boy.
One of my most embarrassing moments had to do with Westwood Supper Club. I had a blind date that night, and the man was from, or the teenager was from Connecticut, and he was touted as a great dancer. So I said, certainly, I'd love to go. And they picked me up. I dressed very carefully because this was an older, very sophisticated, worldly man, I was certain. So I dressed very carefully, and I thought I looked stunning in my black velvet. And it was only after we got to Westwood Supper Club and I happened to look down, I realized I still had on my bedroom slippers.
A familiar entertainer at many Richmond night spots was a dancer named Pleasance Snowball Crump. He was known for his gravity-defying chair dance and his unfailing devotion to the city.
Snowball Crump to me was the epitome of a wonderful era of fun and frivolity and parties. But I think more than anything else, I got to know Snowball Crump because of what a great human he was. He worked at Bellwood during the war and did so much for Bond shows. He would dance for anybody and everybody, and even when he got up close to the 80s, he was still going to senior citizen centers and so forth. Smiling, always positive, a wonderful guy that I shared many shows and many wonderful moments with. Snowball Crump, a real credit to this community.
John Marshall Hotel, Richmond Hotel, Chamberlain Hotel. Danced at all them places, tapped some. And then I used to sing an old song called Ain't Misbehaving. Ain't misbehaving, da-da-da-dee, da-da-da-dee-dee, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Ain't misbehaving, saving all my love for you. For you, for you, for you. Da 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 dee 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 da 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 all by myself. Da 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 da, you and the radio. Da 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 da, saving all my love for you. Yes, for you, baby, saving all my love for you. Da 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 da. Bang. Tuxedo, high hat. Terry, strutting, special dance shoes. Oh boy. Just bring back some of the good memories now. I would love it.
Tantilla Garden billed itself as the South's most beautiful ballroom. From 1931 until its closing in 1969, Tantilla was a place for dancing cheek to cheek, for big band music and romance. It was a different time, another place, the perfect place to make memories.
Oh yes, I went to Thomas Jefferson High School, and the Tantilla, to go to Tantilla was the epitome of a date. And so on special occasions, my special boyfriend, who I later married, and I would go in a group. And to go to Tantilla was just the very best thing that you could do in the city of Richmond. And it was quite an experience. And it was very important to everybody. It wasn't only a social occasion, but you met your friends, and it proved to them that you had arrived, that there was nothing else finer than to be in Tantilla.
As far as I'm concerned, and I think most people will agree, Tantilla was the center of entertainment back in the late 30s and the 40s. Dancing was coming on, and we danced. Everybody danced, and you danced every night. People will be surprised today to remember that Tantilla was open every night. It was filled during the week. It held 1,100 people, and there were 1,100 people there. You couldn't get in many nights. All of the salesmen going to drugstores, going to grocery stores, had little passes that they would pass out, and for 20 or 40 cents, I think it was 20 cents for this little pink slip, you could still get in. It was the place where you celebrated. Another thing about Tantilla, to show you what a style setter it was, in the early days, and for many years, it was formal. People danced formal, went in formal clothes. And with 1,100 people packed in there almost every night, You can imagine this was a small community then. People had to go really out in the country to get to Tantilla.
Well, it was fun to go to Tantilla Gardens because I hadn't been to Tantilla Gardens before, and I hadn't dated, and it was interested to see what he was going to be like on a first date.
The dance floor was always crowded, and so you could go out on the dance floor and have a good time without doing these gyrations or being counted on doing one of them.
Yeah, and I found out he couldn't dance very well, and so he didn't want to go out unless the floor was crowded, you know.
And it was a special.
Still today.
You couldn't get a drink up there, so everybody would carry their brown bag and set it on the table, and then you'd order setups, and you could fix a drink to have then, but you'd see everybody coming in clutching a little brown bag.
Bill Zickafoose, leader of the Continentals, a 16-piece big band, remembers the nights he played at Tantilla.
Getting into Tantilla was very hard. They had a lot of steps, about 30 feet up total, and about halfway was a platform. And we had to carry our music up those steps, the amplifiers and all of our equipment up those back steps. And it was really difficult, especially at the end of an evening. We'd play all night with maybe 3 or 4 hours, and then when we'd finish, we'd have to get all this equipment back down to the car. So many a night, John King and I would be at the top of the steps looking down at the car and we'd say, well, shall we just drop the amplifier down to the ground tonight?
There was a bowling alley there called Tiny Town, and that was very popular too. But I only went to Tantilla. That was for me. And of course it was popular all through the war too. You know, USO and the servicemen. I mean, it has lots of memories.
My most vivid memory of Tantilla was when they auctioned off all the furniture up there in the place. We realized that it was gone. You know, Tantilla was going to be gone forever.
History records dates and places, famous people and their great deeds. As a city, Richmond is rich in history and filled with monuments to the past. And its people are rich in the memories of a special place they called home, and a time that lives on in their hearts. Thank you for sharing those memories with us.